So in order for me to make this, because I wanted to really make it practical, because we can talk about this for the next like 3 days and even more, because there's so many things to cover and talk about. So even for me, when I sat down and I put together this presentation, it was very overwhelming at first, because I wanted to like think what is the best way to approach this in a way that someone listening to this can action items from it. So I wanted to get right away into like tactics, and I'll talk about strategy at the end, but I wanted to make it tangible so that you can think of it in context to what you actually work on, especially if you're like managing an e-commerce site, whether it's your own business or whether it's someone else's business that you optimize for. So the very first thing is XML Sitemaps and indexation. So I think a lot of people will be familiar with this, but I wanted to reiterate a very important point, which is the difference between XML Sitemap versus HTML Sitemap. And the reason for that, because really, if you understand the difference and you're able to like leverage it differently, it will make a huge difference to how you're actually optimizing your website from a technical standpoint. And it's really the foundation of everything that you do. So think of it as like the building blocks. You have your website. You need to make sure that you have a sitemap. And as the name suggests, sitemap, it's literally a map of your website, so that you're helping Google and you're helping other search engines really understand what your website is about. So the XML sitemap is actually for search engines, while the HTML sitemap is for users. So the best way to think of it in a more practical way, sometimes when you go to a website and it says at the footer sitemap, and you click on that little tiny thing at the bottom, it takes you to an actual like sitemap that's still HTML, because it's part of the website and it's designed for the actual users to find their way around the website. So that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about XML sitemap. So an example is what I included on the right side. So XML sitemaps are not really viable. They're not like available for the user, unless you're an SEO and you're like a nerd, like what I do. I just go and like hack websites and look at their XML sitemaps. Like most people will have no idea what I'm talking about, you know, because you have to access it through an index, because it's not part of the visible website. And as you can see, it looks scary for someone who hasn't seen it before, because it's very technical, and it's just literally an output of URLs that are structured in a way that includes attributes. Examples of that are the most important is the loc. So you can see where it says loc, so that's the location of the URL. And then also there are multiple child sitemaps within the index of the sitemap. So you can categorize it. And the beauty of this, it's not like there's a Bible that tells you have to do X amount of sitemaps. There's guidelines that you can follow, and that's why I recommend websites like sitemap.org. So this is like a great website for you to understand, like, and I can mention it to you at the end as well. If you really want to understand the protocol of how to build a sitemap from scratch, it has great references on how to do that. But today I'm not going to go into details. I'm just providing you an overview of that. So it includes attributes like the location of the URL plus last mod, which is when was it last modified. And the reason for that, especially when you're e-commerce, you are literally updating your content every single day, if not every single hour sometimes, especially with bigger e-commerce sites. So you need to always tell Google when you have fresh content. And for that reason, you need to indicate that this was last modified, let's say yesterday or today. And it will ensure that you have a continuous flow of information. And it's super important as well, because it really makes it more efficient for websites, especially the ones that are massive websites, like with thousands, millions of URLs, that can be very overwhelming for your crawl budget to try to go through each individual URL. You're telling Google, hey, this is what I want you to crawl, and these are the most important URLs for me. So that way, Google starts to understand, okay, this website contains X amount of URLs, and 50% of them are products, 30% are categories, 20% are blogs, and so on. So it starts to understand what your actual website is about, and it helps you get indexed and get performing better from a search possibility as well, a visibility perspective, sorry. And then the key takeaway that I wanted to emphasize from this as well is you really need to make sure that you're optimizing your indexation rate. So let's say, take a step back, you built your sitemap, you've done a great job, you have the XML index, and there are different ways of building it. Sometimes there are, depending on the CMS that you use, there's plugins that helps you like automatically create the XML sitemap. And sometimes when it becomes little bit more advanced and you have like dev resources, you can actually build it from scratch, and you can build a database that pulls the information from the website and updates it. So there are really many ways around it. What matters is the output, which is the sitemap index. And it's very important that you also claim your Google Search Console. So Google Search Console is a tool free from Google where it helps you understand your actual search data. So I cannot emphasize enough, you really need to make sure that you have claimed your Google Search Console, because it's like your best friend. It will help you understand how Google sees your website and how it interacts with it, if there are errors, if there are redirects. So you're able to really monitor the health and the indexation of your website. And that way you kind of like covered the tech foundational aspect of your website. So yeah, back to that point around optimizing the indexation rate. Many times you need to make sure, especially if it's like a tool that's more like a plugin doesn't take into account clear tech requirements. Sometimes what happens is 404 page gets submitted. So that's an error page. So you're submitting something that's already an error to Google. So you're unnecessarily making your indexation rate lower than what it can be. So just pay attention to like erroring pages. Pay attention to like making sure that the status is 200, that it's an actual page that loads and actually exists. Also, sometimes there's no index pages. And the reason for that, again, depending on the complexity of the website, you can actually input a no index tag, especially when, let's say, products sell out and you don't want Google to index the page anymore. So you're submitting a page where you're telling Google, hey, don't index this. You're like, okay, cool, I'm not gonna index it. And then it lowers your like indexation rate. So just paying attention to these, maybe it's small things, but it really makes a difference to how much you optimize your funnel when it comes to indexation. Also, making sure that you have the correct canonical tags on your URLs, especially if you're operating in international markets. And I'll cover that also in a later slide. But just as an overall, I would always say, make sure that you have a sitemap, an XML sitemap. Make sure that it's built and it's following the proper formula of how to build it, and that you're submitting it to Google. And once you do that, don't give up on it. Continue to monitor it and continue to use it as a framework for making sure that you're telling Google, these are the pages that are important to me, and this is how they're getting indexed, and so on. So that's the first point.
So, and real quick, I just had a question about that. So when you're, so just to make sure that I'm understanding properly what you're saying, so the optimization of your indexation is essentially just making sure that you're not having like dead pages. You're not having 404s, you're not having like errors that are popping up or warnings that are popping up inside of Google Search Console. Am I understanding that correct?
Yes, and I would say even a better way to think about it, because you are submitting a sitemap. And sometimes what happens with many websites, you don't necessarily want Google to crawl every single page of your website every single day. So you really want to prioritize the URLs that are the most important to you. And that's why you want to make sure you're not including errors or redirects or pages that don't add value to what your intention is when it comes to indexation. So that's the best way to think about it, because Google will still discover your website regardless. Like that's the thing with SEO, which can be tricky, especially when you work in-house. It's like an ongoing, you need to always validate, like, why are you doing this? What kind of benefit will bring? And even sitemaps, you can potentially argue that Google will still discover you without a sitemap. But the way it will discover you, it won't be as efficient, and it also won't be as optimized. So why put yourself in a position where you're not optimizing it from a technical standpoint? And that's why sitemaps are important. But Google sometimes will discover pages that you're not submitting, and it will not prioritize them as much as if you were submitting them.
Gotcha. And that's where it kind of falls into where you can no index a page and Google will still index a page. Are you just saying that that's basically when that case happens, Google is going to assign automatically a lower priority to the page that you're no indexing?
It would not index it, because Google will respect that, because you're saying no index, so it will not index it. But what will happen is when you're looking at the number of URLs that you're submitting versus the number of URLs that are indexed, it won't be as accurate, because let's say you're submitting 10 and 2 of them are no index. So instead of having 100% indexation rate, you have an 80% indexation rate. So why have 80 when you can have hundreds?
Makes sense.
That's a better way of thinking about it.
Totally. Looks like we did have a question. We have a guest asking, should you be descriptive with the names of the different parts of the XML, like products, blogs, or recipes?
Yes, 100%. Especially when it comes to, like, think of them as child sitemaps. So you have the main index, which is sitemap underscore, as you can see, like index. So that's like the parent sitemap. But then when you're actually building the child sitemaps based on the content of your website, try to categorize them. So for example, if you know you have products, name one of them products. And it's also very possible that you will have multiple child sitemaps. So it could be like 3 product child sitemaps, and that's okay, especially if you have a lot of URLs. Same thing. So have products, categories, designers, blogs, and so on. So the clearer, the better it is for Google.